alternate approaches to accessibility. Our current approaches to accessibility have been successful for some technologies and for some disabilities. But penetration or adoption has been estimated at only 5 to 10% of products or websites, and then only for people with some types, degrees, and combinations of disability. This presentation and panel was therefore included to explore whether emerging technologies might allow us to address accessibility in new ways quite different from and complementary to past strategies. New strategies that might be able to provide accessibility for more disabilities and more products. Strategies that might work for both the largest company and the smallest developer. Speaker bios are at futureofinterface.org/bios. With me is Sina Baram, and we were talking recently about alternate approaches. And I had asked him to comment on something I was doing, and he had said that he had similar thoughts. And so we thought we would talk about them. And it's not so much an alternative as in don't do everything we've been doing, let's do something completely different, but something that we can do to try to address all of the parts that aren't being addressed by what we're doing now. So Sina's going to lead off, and then I will follow, and then we'll have a panel to talk about it. As we're going along, if you leave questions and things like this, we will pick them up and also bring those to the panel. So without you, I pass the microphone to Sina. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thanks, Greg. Thanks for having me, everybody. Nice to see hear some amazing familiar names in the attendees list, and a real pleasure to be spending time with everybody today. By way of a quick description, I'm a light-skinned young guy in his mid-30s, and let's see here, have a little bit of a beard and some dark hair. I'm a blind computer scientist and have a lot of experience, both lived experience in terms of using access technologies, because that's my mediation layer to interact with the world, and also helping create them and advising on the interoperability with various AT in terms of digital accessibility, inclusive in design, and building buildings and various digital offerings and things of that nature. To dive right in, I'm going to open with a couple of premises, right? A couple of assertions, and then talk about a few assumptions that Greg and I are making in what we are proposing. After going over some of those assumptions, then want to turn to a few considerations and implications therein to tease out this idea that that he and I chatted about a little while ago, and that we've both been thinking about for quite some time. So I believe it to be true that it is simultaneously true that we live in the most accessible time in human history, and we live in the most inaccessible time at human history. I additionally believe it to be true that the gap between and the distance between that which is being made inclusive and accessible and all offerings that are being created, that gap is increasing, and it is increasing at an exponential rate. I don't feel these are controversial statements to make. So simultaneously true that in 2023, I as a blind person have access to many pieces of technology that I did not 10 years ago, 20 years ago. But it is also true that there's even more, and quite a lot more at an ever increasing rate, that I don't have access to. And so what that tells me is something that I've felt to be true for 20 years, which is that what we are doing right now is broken. This model of letting something come out, figuring out how to make it accessible, etc., is completely broken. I'm a huge advocate of inclusive and universal design, but honestly, that only gets you so far and still does not address the exponential gap problem that I've been referring to. So we need a better solution if we're going to zoom out one level and ask ourselves at a meta level how we can really address for and solve for accessibility in the future, such that we're not always in this contiguous and arms race that we will just simply lose. It's as simple as that. And as a result of losing it, we will be leaving, as we are currently doing, hundreds of millions to billions of people behind due to differences of ability and simply not fitting into the nominal assumptions we have about our users, right? So to that end, I want to go over some things that are top of my mind and Greg's mind in terms of assumptions about what is possible 20 years from now, right? So the timeline that Greg presented to me was about 20 years in the future. What can we make some assumptions about? Well, a couple of these are to begin. So let's see here. The first is that we want to, we feel pretty safe in saying that automatically generated text will be human indistinguishable from human generated text, right? That's already the case today for some humans and some generations of text. In 20 years, I feel it's a safe assumption to make that this will only be greater and greater. I'm not making any claims about whether AI will be able to detect other AI generated text or anything of these natures. I'm not making any assertions about watermarking and other techniques that fall under the realms of ethical AI. Those are all fantastic things to talk about. I just want to assert that people, when presented with a paragraph of text or any length of text, will not be able to distinguish whether or not it was written by a computer, right? That's one assumption. Another one is the same assumption, but for generation of speech. So whether that is an artificial voice, which is an amalgamation or a fictional voice that has been synthesized on the fly, or whether it is, as we're seeing today, things like deepfakes and voice cloning based technology, or a hybrid solution therein. My assertion here again is that generated speech will be indistinguishable from human speech for most users, right? We can caveat that for most users, right? So let's keep going. There's a couple of ways these are all going to come together, right? Linguistic transformations will be seamless, and that includes things that involve a little bit of semantic understanding. Now, this is a pretty broad claim to make, and there may be some quibbles over the timeline of 20 years of solving it. I personally believe this problem has an incredibly long tail, so we're not going to get it 100% correct, but to a vast majority of use cases, at least for the purposes of those that will help us in talking about the accessibility considerations we want to consider, I believe this to be doable. So what does that mean? That means that if you are presented with a paragraph of text and need that transformed into a fourth grade reading level, that is something that will be seamlessly doable 20 years from now. Already we can see the preliminary results of that work being possible today with obviously high error bars, as many of us know. Secondly, it means that translation of that text is possible, whether it is to simplified English, whether it is to another language, etc. Right? And this is important because it means that we can start decoupling the act of the creation of content from the implications of the accessibility of that content. Right? So if we're able to fast forward a little bit, and if we're able to dream a little bit, which was kind of the mandate here, let's assume that these semantic transformations, these linguistic transformations are possible and seamlessly doable, right? Additionally, I'm going to posit that bidirectional recognition, so production and recognition and production of ASL is something that will be, and I have in the notes here, good, right? So this one I'm putting a little bit less of a positive spin on, but I do think it's already good. I mean, I've already seen some offerings in this space in private industry that really can't be talked about too much in a public forum that are making progress in this space. I feel comfortable stating that in 20 years, let's make a few assumptions about the environment facilitating bidirectional recognition and synthesis of American Sign Language and really of the body of signed languages, right? Additionally, I think that scene analysis will and related genres of computer vision will be at the point where description, and that is to say real-time description, will be possible not only of static images. We're seeing a lot of that work these days, and it's been done for the past few years. All of the problems and issues therein, both with respect to fidelity, biases in data sets, all of those things. But in 20 years, I fundamentally believe that the ability of a computer to describe the contents of a photograph is going to be in a far better and more utilitarian state than it is today. And already today, it makes a significant difference in my life. There are dozens of use cases per month, per week even, in which automated recognition of photographs, as rudimentary as it is today, whether it's in iOS, in Chrome, in other offerings, already makes a difference in my life. So I feel good about fast forwarding that one. The perhaps stronger claim here is that will also be true for real time or time-based media, which is to say video. So in other words, I'm positing that given a video sequence of, let's say, 30 seconds long, I can ask the computer to give me an audio description of that which occurred in the video. Again, there's already been preliminary work on this, and there's papers being released on those topics, right? All right, let's keep going. So then inputs into these systems, right? Automated systems, AI systems, chatbots, what have you, will go beyond audio, visual, and text. So what do we mean by that? What we mean by that is that, for example, on the body, we will have access to various sensor data streams, temperature, pulse, blood sugar, these kinds of things. Again, many of this already possible today, right? Apple Watch and similar, Fitbit and other devices offer some of these. So again, assuming an advancement of 20 years, that feels good. That feels like a good place to be. I added into this list, however, BCI adjacent technologies. And by that, I mean brain computer interface. So whether that's EEG, whether P300 response type stuff, whether that is looking at signals that are mainly meant for neuromotor control, right? And then interpreting that. So for example, some of us are familiar with getting text elicitation out of brains of folks with locked-in syndrome, or being able to write by thinking of the letters you would handwrite and then having that text appear on the computer screen, etc. I'm positing that kind of input will be available to these systems, whether it's a personal assistant or AI chatbot, etc. Right? On the environmental side of things, I'm positing that we will have access to things like the usual temperature, humidity stuff, my house has right now, just by way of commercially off-the-shelf available smart home technology, but that it will go further, especially in the sense of a little bit of chemical analysis. So think of things like smell, but really chemical analysis in the general sense. So whether that's a proximal CO2 sensor that can then, for example, make certain assertions about respiration rates, or whether that is for safety in terms of carbon monoxide, et cetera. Like a lot of these systems exist now. I'm asserting that the wiring and the integration of them will be more seamless, but also that the utility of them, especially on the chemical analysis, will be a little bit better. And that matters because of things like being able to smell when something is burning, not just from a fire detection perspective, but actually from an augmentation perspective for purposes of making cooking more inclusive, independently doable, accessible, etc. So that's a toy example, but this kind of chemical analysis should be considered as a valid input into these systems. All right, let's keep going with this list of assumptions. So additionally, in terms of, that was input. In terms of output, we're asserting that we're also going to go beyond audio, visual, text. So what does that mean? Well, on the body, we can think about vibrotactile or haptics, right? We can think about temperature and pressure, so the ability to apply a little bit of force. This will be explored, of course, in depth for virtual reality and immersive experiences, but can be used for many other things as well, right? The application of pressure, for example, to alleviate certain forms of anxiety, or that may be helpful to autistic users, et cetera, et cetera. Additionally, that the it is quite possible that we may have some form of automated drug delivery, right? And I list this in here because of some conversations that Greg and I had about how, as part of certain therapies that combine both drug usage in addition to immersive environments like virtual reality or augmented reality, how those things come together and how there's an interplay with especially folks whose disability or simply medical status may involve them requiring certain medications. What does that all mean? I think it's something we need to be thinking about and talking through. So I'm listing it in the assumptions as perhaps some minimal form of drug delivery will be possible, right? Whether that's through automated implant, etc. So the idea then is that we have these inputs, we have these outputs, we have these assumptions that we're making. There's a few others that I'm going to get to. These can be combined, right? So even using existing what is possible to be done today, albeit not as accurately as we would like it to be 20 years from now, you could imagine, for example, two users using different modalities being able to communicate with one another. One may be using speech to text, another one may be using sign language, them having a conversation that is mediated through technology, but is able to be more and more reflective of the original user intent and not as dependent upon external factors like relying on a human for interpretation, right? Not making any claims about value judgments or objective assertions about level of quality, just that this is going to be possible and more possible given advances in AI. If we think, therefore, about interfaces, which is really the point of where we're going with all of this, what does that really mean? And one of the things that it means is that interfaces must be more customizable. We heard that in the last session, that we really want to push back against this notion, albeit a long-standing one, that an interface is designed and then presented to the masses with maybe a few levers and knobs that you can tweak, but then you're done. You're stuck with what Microsoft has conceived of for Microsoft Word. You're stuck with what Zoom has conceived of for the Zoom interface. Instead, whether it is through simulated inputs or through proper programmatically based, API access and automation, can we have interfaces that are truly customizable or that are layerable? So in other words, there's a mediation layer that acts on your behalf with the interface. If the native interface does not do what you need it to do, does your assistant, does your automated assistant have the capability of pushing that button for you, of taking your speech input and manipulating the user interface in a way that will then facilitate you being able to have access and not spending your cognitive energy on how to access these things, and instead spending your cognitive energy on the content, on the task, on the creative pursuit, on whatever it is that you're trying to do. Additionally, this implies, as part of it, that personal agents, semi to fully automated ones, will exist. And Greg and I go back and forth. These may live in the cloud. For privacy reasons, we of course want them to be able to be run locally and on premises so that there's not this dependency on external communications systems, and also for privacy and other reasons. But the point being, a personal assistant that is not just invocable through some transactional method like Siri is, but an actual semi-real-time monitoring capability of a personal assistant that is a dialogic interface, right? So it uses natural language in order to map your user intent, what you want. I'm feeling cold, and I'm feeling cold gets translated to, let's raise the temperature in this room. Easy to do that with home automation technology that gets mapped to the appropriate assertions. We don't have to be talking about, tell the thermostat to raise the temperature. We don't have to go to that level. We can just express a state of being and then have the computer figure out what the action is to resolve whatever whatever intent we're expressing, right? That again is a toy example because frankly that exists today. There's some popular examples going around on YouTube. You can Google this, where, for example, one gentleman I saw simply spent an afternoon hacking ChatGPT to be a shortcut on iOS, and then he was able to converse with ChatGPT, had ChatGPT generate some programmatic code to interface with his smart home, and he was able to make certain statements, and then the smart home would respond. For example, he said, I just noticed the lights were off, or I just noticed I'm sitting in the dark in my office. And then the computer responded by turning on the lights. There was no, what do you want me to do about that? There was no back and forth and all of these kinds of things. So I'm asserting that that level of comprehension and automated intention mapping is going to be better 20 years from now, right? And just a few others here. In terms of infrastructure, we're asserting that certain baseline affordances, like of a building, the map of the building, the information about a building, will become more available to us in an automated way, right? So we're not making any assertions about how that's happening. Those who wish to dive deep into this could look at like Bluetooth broadcasts and other things. We're putting that aside for a second, simply asserting that the affordance will exist in the environment such that you walk into a building and are able to access localized information about that building in terms of its offerings, right? For those familiar with Seeing AI's recent release of indoor navigation, which is honestly probably the only impressive indoor navigation I've seen in the last 20 years. Lots of room for improvement, but it's quite fantastic for where it is. You could imagine that the building could surface those routes, which are already shareable, and therefore you're able to provide folks with information that is contextual to what they need. I need to get to the doctor's office. It knows that's on the 3rd floor. It can send you an accessible route that has audio cues, text-to-speech affordances, vibrotactile feedback, etc. Right? That's doable with today's technology, again, be it nascent and emerging. So we feel good about saying 20 years from now, that can be in a better state, right? Additionally, strong advances will be made in mapping user intent to actions. And I talked about this already, so I'm not going to go in too much detail for this. But again, the idea is like one of the examples I have in the talking notes is make sure I don't miss the delivery person when they come by, right? You could imagine, well, wait a minute, that's solvable today. I get a push alert on my phone when my smart doorbell recognizes that there's a person there. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the delivery person, right? So there's a lot of nuance implied here that will be meaningful and accessible to a large number of folks, right? As opposed to those who are technically savvy and know how to set these things up, right? Things like summarize this chart for me, right? There's been a lot of work on that, so advancing that forward. Turn these bullet points into a nicely formatted presentation, right? So again, not just linguistic transformation, but content-based transformation across various formats that may be available and more accessible for people. And lastly, knowledge queries, right? What was the name of that restaurant that Greg and I went to? And so based on context clues, maybe it needs to ask you which Greg you're talking about. I could say Vanderheiden, and then it could say the last time you hung out with Greg Vanderheiden was about 5 years ago. It was in Seattle, and your calendar shows this restaurant, right? Something along those lines. Again, not rocket science, doable in a pre-scripted way now. My assertion is that that will be doable in an automatic way moving forward. And that has obvious implications as an assist and augmentative tool for anybody with difficulty remembering, with anybody who is just, you know, I myself, for example, am terrible with names. I can remember numbers from 20 years ago. Ask me to remember a name I learned 30 minutes ago, and I'll be hard pressed to do it. I would use something like that, you know, absolutely. But then other folks may have to depend on something like that because that kind of knowledge, you know, that kind of knowledge recall is difficult, right? So I'm claiming that these are some baseline assumptions that we're holding to be true in order to motivate an idea, right? And so in you know the next little section here, I want to talk to you about what that idea is. So we're informally referring to this as like an iBot or information bot, and there's a related concept of individual user interface generation, right? So what do we mean by that? What we're trying to get at is that imagine that you have a toaster oven. And this toaster oven is not accessible, right? It doesn't have text to speech. It doesn't have vibrotactile feedback. It doesn't have buttons that are tactile, right? In nature, maybe it's a flat touch screen, right? I actually own one, right? It's a pretty inaccessible device. The reason I own one today in 2023 and 2022 is when I bought it, is because I knew that I could programmatically do what I needed to get done. And I have a lot of privilege. I'm a computer scientist. I know how to script these things, etc. I have a voice assistant like Alexa that's possible. So it's a doable environment for me to have an accessible toaster oven, even though its physical interface is totally inaccessible to me. So imagine if that is doable, but not by just myself in a highly technical way with workarounds, but for anybody. How do we get there? What is required to get us there? And the underlying assumption is that the inputs into, let's say, an information bot that would be needed to get us there should not be anything more than what is available to, let's say, an average user as defined pretty inaccurately. So I'm not going to have a lot of precision here. Let's say like 50% nominal user, right? So if you have like a 50% of humans, can that human access this interface? If so, then the information bot should be able to, because it can see the controls such a human could see, and it can understand the text such a human could understand, and it can understand the visual metaphors that such a human could understand. It could hear the things that such a human, if they are able to hear, could understand, etc. Right? So if that's doable, if that's possible, then can we map that to an interface that is specific to you, the person who desires a different interface? So for example, for me, I may prefer a speech-based interface. I may prefer it in Braille. I may prefer it to be in a tactile display with buttons that bubble up with microfluidics. Whatever the output mechanism is, we want to have a mediation layer here that decouples the dependency of this toaster oven being completely made accessible and perfectly so by the manufacturer, and instead post facto can we interact with something the way that the manufacturer is expecting anyone to, and then translate that and solve that problem from an accessibility perspective. So the tall claim, it involves a boatload of assumptions that we've enumerated above. And what it means, though, is that if we can do this, we can extend that to other means of access. We can extend that, for example, to soft user interfaces, not something like a toaster oven, but you can imagine a website or a mobile app where if you need, for any level of reason, the interface to be remapped into simply a list of options, then that could be done. You could list, for example, in such a situation, all the affordances on a screen. We already have the ability to do that. For example, in iOS, there's plenty of ways of doing that. And you can enumerate them in a list-like form. You could use semantic analysis to then hierarchically store those. So you could ask the user, what are you trying to do, right? I just need to pick out a gift. These options are available, right? Instead of needing to interact with the Amazon app. Instead of needing to interact with a pre-formulated Netflix list of thumbnails, which may not be as accessible to you. So the idea here is that there exists such a smart agent that is able to do the level of analysis that, for lack of a better word, 50% of humans would be able to do, assuming nominal vision, hearing, and these kinds of things, and then able to translate that into an interface that's most appropriate for you, right? Whether that's speech, whether that's sign language, whether that is reduction of complexity for cognitive differences, whether that's something as simple as just a monochromatic mode, right? That's the idea. Now, the other thing that comes into play here is that there's a sequencing for this. We're not imagining a world where overnight we just snap our fingers and auto-magically such interfaces come into being. We need a body of work there. There's already some work being done statically in this way. Video games and other applications have been made accessible through different modalities, different forms of, for example, there were a absolute dozens and dozens of accessible Twitter clients, for example, all for different needs, right? So this kind of stuff is happening when humans are generating it. We want to live in a world where the AI is able to generate that for you. So at the beginning, what that's going to require is for lots of different research to come together to come up with these optimal use cases for different audiences. Whether and how big those audiences are, we're not making an assertion about. It could be at an individual level, or it could be for 20% of blind people. We're simply stating that there exist specialized interfaces that we shouldn't be afraid of, but instead be able to synthesize on the fly. And to get there, we need to make them manually, bring them together as a library or a constellation of different offerings that are open source in nature and that are able to be built upon and improved, with the singular goal, though, of not needing humans to generate them in the future, the singular goal of them being able to be synthesized in the future automatically, right, based on user intent. The only other thing I'll dwell on here before turning it over to Greg is that the reason that this is so important, and the reason that I fundamentally, can simultaneously believe that this is an incredibly difficult problem, but it's really the only necessary way to solve this gap, is that no matter how optimistic I try to make myself about prevalence of accessibility knowledge, predominance of prioritizing inclusivity in product design, shifting left considerations around access, increasing curricula around the world in terms of what we teach designers, I don't see us landing in a world where things are able to be used by the widest possible audience. It's still going to be designed for some nominal user, and maybe we're going to do a better job increasing the error bars on that nominal user. We're going to give people certain knobs and levers, but I don't see us living in a world where, for example, I'll just use a personal example, I myself would be able to play with the latest thing a tech startup has come up with in 2040, because it's not going to be born inclusive. Right? And instead of trying to attack this at the infrastructure layer, which has been the mode of thinking about it for the last 60 or so years, better screen readers, better accessibility APIs, better frameworks, semantic annotation, all the usual things like ARIA for the web, declarative frameworks, all of the usual suspects. Instead of trying to accelerate those things, we're thinking of a world in which that could be solved at runtime by an intelligent agent, right? Lastly, the one thing about considerations, and again, there's many considerations we're not enumerating here because we wanted to tease out these ideas first, but it is important to think through how something like this would be manifest and understand that, much like current infrastructure, there will be a large variance based on locale, socioeconomic differences and status, different countries, things of this nature, right? And so we have problems with bridges and other infrastructure in this country from 100 years ago. There's absolutely, no way I don't see us having the same level of differences where one building is going to be smart and another one is not going to be. So what do we do about graceful degradation really comes into play. And what do we do about mixed environments in which maybe in your home, these things work flawlessly and magically like I've described, right? It's just a fantasy and it's wonderful. But then when you go to your local coffee shop that's in a historic building, half of these affordances are not available to you. How do we make sure that we're solving for that continuum is something that is important to highlight. I'm going to take a pause here and turn it over to Greg. Greg, is there anything that I didn't touch on that you'd like me to before passing it over to you to sort of take us back a level and go at this at another angle?
No, I need to, I think that's good. And let's dive back in, and I'll pull you back in again. We'll be doing this in full discussion at the end. Going back just a step, when I first thought of the concept of Infobot before and IUIGs, before I found out that Sina was thinking along the same lines, the reason was a problem, and I saw then, and I think we're seeing it even now, it's getting worse. the current approach is working, but in a very, very limited fashion. We're talking about like 3% of the different products are accessible. Web pages, it's slightly higher, but every time they do an evaluation, it's down. Pages that were accessible yesterday are no longer accessible today. The organizations that put out accessibility guidelines, their own websites don't meet them. The places that have huge accessibility teams, have made some amazing advances, but it's still just like, it's like amazing advances on the edge. But we still don't have good things for some disabilities. Cognitive language and learning disabilities. No matter how much time has been spent, and more time has been spent in discussions and standards and everything else on that group than any other, and it's still the worst served. The AT safety net, we say, well, if those products aren't accessible, then they can use AT. It's full of holes. Cognitive language and learning, again, if we don't have any really good AT for that. But even areas like people say, well, at least blindness is, and they always get the best. They're always covered. And I go, yeah, bright, technically oriented blind people, they're all set. But there are a lot of blind people who go to screen reader school, if you will, and training programs, and they drop out. They can't figure out how to use a screen reader. That means they can't use a computer. I mean, imagine you can't use a computer. We have things built into the iPhone, and yet, and it's been just amazing to the people who can use it, who are blind. It's just, the most amazing advance in decades. However, C and I both have people who are blind who come to us and want to know how we can try to create a different interface, because they can't figure out how to use the interface that's on the phone. And so if they can't use a computer and they can't use a smartphone, what do you mean the problem is solved for blindness? So we need to be looking at this, and it's going to get worse in the future. We're getting more and more closed products where you can't even install AT, you can't connect AT, and we are building the built-in accommodations are great if they hit you, but how do I say this? There's also an average person with a disability, or there's an average person with a disability who's also technically oriented and high functioning. But there's all of the rest of the population. And this is a problem. Product security is increasing, meaning more and more things are being locked down so that even the accessibility stuff isn't working. We see companies that will have 4 products and they all have a feature for people with cognitive disabilities, highlighting, reading or something, but it's only 3 of all their products, and it's designed differently in each product. So if you have a cognitive disability, an intellectual disability, you have a problem, because depending upon which page you have in front of you from the same company, they're different, and different companies, they're all different between them. And when they figure out how to use something, somebody comes along and figures out how to make a better one, and they change it. Or people just hire a new product designer. And of course, if you're a new product designer, why did you hire me if I'm not supposed to redesign your interface? And everybody gets lost again. And unfortunately, it's not just people with cognitive language and learning, but all of us suddenly find that the interface on our HBO Max or something like that changed. We can't figure out what anything is. And if we're having trouble, what kind of trouble are people who have intellectual disabilities? How about people who are older? How about people with crystallized intelligence? They're really bright about anything in the past, but they just are not able to learn new stuff. And then we're finding the new immersive interfaces that are appearing with no solutions in sight for many disabilities. And we're talking about them, but they're going to start showing up. They're already showing up in workplaces and in education. And as soon as these things stop being so big and ugly and heavy, they're going to take off when people start figuring out how to do it with simple implants. We're going to find, and I know whenever I talk about implants, the first thing that people say is, well, I would never do that. I would never do that to my kids. And I said the same thing, early on. I'm really old school here. In many years ago, and until they show up and say, well, all the other kids at school have got this implant, and so they can access all this information, and how am I going to compete with them? And so we need to look at it. And the implants aren't going to be drilling holes in your head implants. They may be something where you just take an injection, like you get a vaccination or something, and they inject tiny little nano particles that go in and go up and locate where they have to, and begin creating communication and internet and connection. So they don't have to be scary things, and they won't be scary things in the future, just like lots of things that are scary before or not now. The burden on industry is increasing. Product innovation is accelerating. We're getting more and more faster products, but the ability to meet them faces just logistical realities. We're talking about designers, and this one really stops me. We want people in industry to be designing their products so we can all use them. So what does that mean? That means that all of the designers in all of the companies have got to understand all of the disabilities and be able to design for all of them. And we don't even know how to do that. When I get a design problem, somebody calls me in to design something, I call Sina, I call a lot of you up and ask Clayton around cognitive, et cetera, to make sure that if I have to do that after 50 years of doing this, how can we expect every single designer and every one of you probably the same thing? If somebody said, here you're going to design something and it's going to be distributed throughout the United States, you would immediately start calling your colleagues to talk to them. Well, we can't do that. They can't do that. It's impossible for the industry designers to be experts across all. And then they're constantly turning over. And they have to design for all the disabilities at the same time because there's only one product coming out. And as Sina said, you can only build so much flexibility into a product. And it still isn't reaching because we already have things like the iPhone that's got a gazillion accessibility features in it. And do all the disability groups, cognitive language learning, everybody else say, it's all solved. No. And so this is the problem. The result is that designs hit kind of the middle high end of people with disabilities and leave many out. And they're guided by minimum requirements. Even the WCAG and all those guidelines come out. And what do they say? Do they say that if you meet these guidelines, everybody can use it? No, right in the very first paragraph at the top of the accessibility guidelines, it says, you can do everything in here and there'll still be people who can't use your product. And what's in there is even more limited because we can't even figure out how to describe how to make things work for all the different disability groups. Going forward, we're going to have VR, AR. We're going to have conversational interaction. And yet we find that some people can't do that. We have search engines that are really powerful, but there are some people who can't figure out how to find anything because they don't know how to ask the question. I use ChatGPT all the time, really effectively, but I know how to use it. I have other people who can't get anything out of it, and they get wrong answers. But there's ways of asking it questions that you can avoid those. Of course, there's a million ways you can ask it to get bad answers, and that's the ones that all get published. But there's a lot of other very interesting strategies that work very well. We're going to have direct brain interfaces. We're going to have natural and abstract gestures. We have people right now on the iPhone where you flick like this to do one thing and you do this for another, and you put two fingers down and twist them to change the amount that the flicks do. And people who are blind who do that, and they just do it reflexively. And there are people blind who can't figure out how to do that at all. So how will industry keep up and try to make products accessible to everybody if you can't do that? And this is the problem we face. It's not that we shouldn't keep doing what we're doing. We should, but we have to figure out how are we going to deal with the other 90% of the products and all of the disabilities that we are not reaching today. So the concept we're having is, what if, in addition to doing what we do now, we add a second approach, and this one generates interfaces that are one-on-one. The interface is the interface that all products would have if everybody in the world looked like this person. Okay, so if nobody in the world had sight, what would the interface on the iPhone look like? And that wouldn't be, well, it would be an audio interpretation of a visual interface, which is what it is now. That's what screen readers do. They try to give you an audio interface to a visual interface to what it is that's trying to happen. But if everybody were blind, it would be a much better, much more efficient. But even there, if you had everybody was blind, if everybody was CINA, it would look like one thing. But if everybody was, once you have a blindness, you don't get out of all the other disabilities. So people with blindness are going to have every other disability, including intellectual disabilities. So what if everybody was blind and had a moderate technical ability, a moderate ability to learn and use technology, and then they had lower and lower? We need to figure out how to have interfaces that can get the functionality to all of these groups. It's kind of like ability-based design focus. You look at individuals. Microsoft had something they would call design for one, benefit all. So what if we had this iBot, and you could aim the iBot at any interface, okay? And it would have just the senses that we have. It would see, it could hear, whatever. And it would be able to figure out and use it. It's not as smart as the smartest person, as Sina said. It would be as smart as the 50th percentile for now. Let's just take that as the target. And maybe it'll get better over time. It then can pass information back to what we call an individual user interface generator. And this generates an interface to whatever product you're aiming it at that looks just like the interface would be if it was designed specifically for this person, this individual. It generates an interface for this individual at their cognitive, at whatever level they're at. And it would have some flexibility too, because all of us, our abilities go up and down a little in people with cognitive disabilities. You'll actually find out that if you lower the level to the point they can understand it, they all of a sudden can understand it at a higher level. You've seen this when someone's talking to you about a concept and you can't understand it. And then they say, well, for example, and they give you a simple example of it. And then all of a sudden you go, oh, okay. Well, the problem is we come at the world with an interface that they don't understand and they're dead. What if it could come down and they could understand it in a simple form, and then it could come back up again? So this is something also that could be done in this kind of a concept. The ability to do that now means that an older person, for example, when they go to use HBO, it gives them an interface they can understand. When they go to watch Disney Plus or Apple TV, they're basically doing the same thing, right? But they all do them in a completely different way. But the IUIG would give them an interface that was familiar to them, that looked basically the same. And when they went to different products, they wouldn't all have like completely different. I bought the house, it had a Nest thermostat in it. And after freezing for the first 2 weeks, because every time I turned the temperature up, it decided it wanted to be at some other temperature, maybe because it was for sale or so for a while, I don't know. I finally went through and looked at the YouTube video and found that the 14 settings you have to turn off in order to get the thermostat to be a thermostat again. Now, seen it before. I want to clarify one thing. He talked about, you're thinking, oh, I'm hot. And all of a sudden, the air conditioner comes on. It's not quite like that. It's not that you're taking all the agency away, but he's just trying to, make a thought that the person doesn't have to understand the concept of a thermostat, et cetera. They could just, want the room to be warmer, and it could be warmer. They would intend it to get warmer. And it wouldn't just be a casual comment. It's kind of like your thermostat. You don't actually control the furnace. You set it to the temperature you want, and then the thermostat tries to turn the temperature up. And then when it gets to, it turns it off and it turns it up. But it's going off of your intent. So we don't want to get too far away, and we want to be careful that we don't lose intent of people. But the idea here is that the interface for the person would have to match the person wherever the person is, and not the other way around, where we have to match the interface. So advantages: a greater portion of people with disabilities would be able to use today's technology. You can think of all the ways that, well, put it this way. Right now, most people with cognitive, who are in the cognitive language and learning, advocacy, design, whatever, we spend a huge amount of our time pushing companies to do something. And if they turned around and said, okay, we're going to design a product right now for whoever you point to somebody and tell us exactly how we should design it. A lot of the time we would say, well, we'd start saying generalities, make it simpler, use simple language. You say, no, no, design one. Show me the exact design that this product should have. And we don't actually know. We don't actually have good answers for some of these because it's never been possible before. This kind of approach would allow us to begin focusing and just pick one individual, pick another individual, and try to figure out how you design a product that would match that individual and really be optimum, and start working with it and start trying it. And a lot of our ideas we find when we start to build them don't work out. We thought it would be usable by them, but it's not. We would begin the process of actually creating a whole body of knowledge we don't have now, which is exactly how you design interfaces for a lot of these people that have been completely outside of the reach. And if you score here, great. Then take somebody with a greater intellectual disability who also has 2 other disabilities. Show us how you design for that one. And each one of these things can then be used as a pattern to be creating individual interfaces for not only that person, but people very close to that person. And if we get a large enough constellation of these, if we have those IUIGs, then instead of some products be accessible, every product you just aim the eyeball at suddenly becomes accessible. And that doesn't mean that they now have, they can't live independently if they only have access to some of the products in their environment, okay? So that's the big problem. We think we did really good because there's 4 things that this person can use, but they've got to live independently. We want them to be able to live independently, and they aren't going to be able to do that unless all of the things they need to do. And some of those things are being designed by companies that have 0 accessibility teams, okay? Of all the companies that exist, only a very small number have any accessibility teams. Of all the companies that are working on innovation, that are inventing the next generation, almost none of them have. Just a few of the big ones we know. Everybody else that's designing the world is designing it with teams, and they have no accessibility team. And if you go talk to them, they go, sometimes I still hear, I'm surprised, but I shouldn't be, people with disabilities use my product. I thought they used AT, or I thought that they made special products for those people. And in this day and age, you'd think that was going away, but we still run into it. And the other ones just sort of, try to look all the other way because they only got 6 people. They don't have room for an accessibility team. And when they went to look at accessibility, you gave them this big long list of like 87 different things they're supposed to think about. And they just can't grok all of that information. So that's one of the advantages of an IUIG is it does that. It takes the people who are expert in disability and has them focus on figuring out how to do it. And then it has the infobot, if you will, that you just can aim at any interface that the person, now, if you can design it so that if that person's abilities fall within the range of what that company can do with their universal design, they don't need it. But whenever they hit something they can't use, they can use this. They pull it up, they aim it at it, and it gives them an interface they can use. If they're blind, they can aim it at a thing, a microwave, and they have a little cuff, and it just gives a little, tactile indication. So literally they can reach out and push the buttons, even though they can't see them, because they're just guided. So there's these kinds of things that can be done. It really takes a huge pressure off. We can stop, yelling at industry to try and solve a problem that we actually don't know how to solve ourselves. If you put us into industry and told us to then respond to ourselves, a lot of us would have a lot of trouble. And again, not the kinds of things that can be done by the industry, but stuff that's out there, and all the little companies that can't do it. What does this require? Advances in machine vision, advances in AI, not just to identify and categorize, but to understand. We need to figure out how to abstract user interfaces. We've done a lot of the work. There was even a standard on it, 24752, but it has A, limitations, and B, we can't go around asking every product to put a standard interface socket on it, okay? The same intelligence that we use to figure out how to create things differently could be used to adapt to, if they just have any ability to say that they would allow external control of the product with any interface using any standard. It's easiest for us to map over to try to do that. We do have to create this collaborative, this Infobot, which we propose to be an open source, public, free Infobot. Everybody can use it. It's in the cloud. You can download it. In the beginning, it may need to be run in the cloud, but quickly it will be downloadable and run, so it can be completely private. So nobody knows what interfaces you're pointing it to. Same thing with IUIGs. It's going to require a massive increase in our understanding of how to design effective interface for all the different types, degrees, and combinations of disability. And anybody who's had multiple disabilities, that's where it really it hurts, because almost all the AT is designed for a single disability, and some AT manufacturers even say, look, I gave it the office. They basically say, I designed for this disability. That's not the disability I work with. And you say, I know, but what if people who are blind also have this other disability? What are they going to do? And they go, I don't know, go talk to that other disability group. But of course, they don't know how to do something for somebody who's blind. So we need to be looking at this. And so these are some of the kinds of things. A little bit of a different social contract. Yes, because we're looking for companies to be able to contribute and to work with this. But if we take some of the pressure off them for some of the disabilities they can't, we have the companies, and there's quite a number of companies. It's a small fraction of all the companies, but there's enough of them that have teams that are really working hard at trying to make things accessible. And if you gave them a target like this that they could contribute to, that would be amazing in terms of the progress and contributions that they could make to such an effort. Does this exist now? No. Do we know how to make this? No. Is it possible? Maybe. We think it really is, and we think it will be, but not if we sit back and wait for it. It's going to take a lot of time and a lot of dedication to do it. Are there holes in what we're talking about? Sure. We would like to find them and talk about them and patch them. And that's the purpose of the panel that follows behind, is we've gathered together people who both can say, this is good, this is great, that's not so much. What about this? How are you going to do that? Et cetera. So that's the purpose of the panel that's immediately following, is to try to help us think this through, evaluate whether or not this really is an approach. We don't see any other approach to handling the 90% of products and all the disabilities that we aren't handling today. So I'm going to wrap up now so that we can bring in our other people. Sina, did you have any final comments?
I wanted to add one thing, if we got just 1 minute, which would be that Greg spoke about inviting researchers and experts in particular disability groups, but it's also important to understand that the system that we're proposing has the capability of not only intuiting and learning from, but being directed by that individual user. So, for example, if we don't nail it with a pre-made available template, the individual user can say, that went by too quickly. That was confusing. I didn't understand what that meant. And so being able to be much better at, again, this mapping of intention problem means that then those experts that were spoken about on the last panel, which is the only expertise that matters, is that of the individual, because their lived experience is the thing we're optimizing for here. That can then all of a sudden be an input into these systems. Whereas right now, I would argue that unless if you are an incredibly advanced AT user with programming expertise, etc., you honestly have no way of meaningfully adapting and changing the interfaces you're presented with. You're basically stuck with what others have conceived. So just to bring it back and make sure that we're not only assuming expertise from others, but centering the disabled user as part of that loop so that it can get better over time.
Oh, that's really excellent. And the trouble is that the more you get away from people that are really cognitively and technically, there's some very, very bright people who can't deal with technology, cognitively and technically oriented, the interface they get is not the interface they want. It's the interface somebody else gave them. And they don't even know how to ask for something else. So can we have it? Don't do that, kind of thing. The person says, "Oh, it's hot in here," and it says, "Okay, I'll turn up the thermostat." And you go, "Don't do that. I didn't tell you to do that." It learns not to do that. There are people who want to talk to their houses. There are people that freaks them out. They just have no desire to ever talk to their house or talk to an appliance. They think it's, something. They have lots of different reasons why they don't want to. So if we get something that's close, maybe they would talk and an interface may decide that a different one, or it will migrate itself to be different. And that's going to be important. Also, over time, we all talk about these, like we know how to design these things. Somebody mentioned earlier that people will find that they will report what they like and what they do. And then later you'll find out by looking at telemetry that that's not what they like and that's not what they do. And they don't actually, what they said they like, they don't ever use. They actually do it this other way and they have no idea. So this kind of a thing can also come in here to allow more and more agency, more and more control. Okay, so at this point, all the other people on the next panel, if you would just turn on your cameras and join us. We're going to turn it over to you and to also the questions that we have. So, and so I'm going to walk through the list and have people make some opening comments. And at the same time, we're going to be looking at questions in the chat. And you can also see the questions and pick up on those yourself. Christian.
Hi there, everybody. Want to make sure that the interpreter can see me just fine, and she can. All right, great. So I'm here to let you all know that Greg and I have been working in collaboration for over 10 years now. Really happy to see all of the familiar faces that I see today again. Also, I wanted to speak from a perspective of deaf and hard of hearing community. So I'll start by saying that the concept of mediating and interpreting information into a familiar concept that we've been familiar with is providing access to communication through coordinating those interfaces and providing that. And that's why I'm sorry, we're gonna have to go back. So I want to make sure that I'm clear that I'm very dedicated to providing that access to communication, and I'm familiar with that concept. So some ways that we can be looking at those new inventions, I feel like I am excited about things that are to come. And also, I do feel like it's very valuable to give people with disabilities more of a personalized autonomy, to give them that autonomy that they deserve. And also, the iBot that you're referring to, I do feel like it has the ability to help a lot of people and to become more independent. I do see the benefits, I also think about being able to have access to a sign language interpreter and to make a personalized type of interpretation is necessary for the deaf community and could be very beneficial. However, there is a but. There's a negative side, a dark side to it. And I'm going to say that there's some red flags that I'm seeing coming up from the community perspective. So Sina had already mentioned a key point there about how from starting where we're at now and being able to get to that future point, how we're going to navigate those things and how we're going to get there. And I really see a lot of potential challenges and problems coming up to be able to achieve what we're looking for. So obviously being a deaf person myself, having new technology emerging and being able to have automated captioning, things like that. You know, as it came up, people are excited about the new technology, but at the same time, the technology wasn't ready for what came out because what we get is a imperfect system. And so people are forced to accept that new technology, but it's not always working correctly for us. And there's a lot of gaps in accessibility. For example, on the television, when we have automated captions, what's going on is that the recognition is just terrible. The voice recognition is just terrible. And so what happens is during webinars and things that events that deaf people are attending, they're just missing out because the technology is just too far behind, as opposed to having a human interpreter there that provides full access. So that's one problem that we're seeing with automated captions. So that's been a big issue in the community, a hot topic, that there's just a lot of gaps there. And companies are refusing to understand and accept why it needs to be adjusted because, of course, of the monetary benefits for them to use automated captions. The other thing that I'm seeing is going on web pages, I see some issues of accessibility with overlays that are being created, that some companies are really fighting on and putting a lot of pressure in the market to create overlays and feeling that that's going to solve all the accessibility problems. And of course, that's not true. And so when we look at that issue and the concept of the iBot and providing access overlays, I just see a lot of similarities and parallels in the two in those two concepts of content and having a way to provide that accessibility, but it's just not, I don't see it working out effectively. So what I mean to say is that people in the community have been very impacted, and I would say, they're just burnt out by having false hopes given to them. And the idea about the iBot, again, I think the concept is a great concept, but I really think that the community, it's going to be a challenge to get the community to buy into it because of the, experiences they've had of being burned by new technologies that just systems weren't ready for. And so I feel like there's a lot of backlash. There would be a lot of backlash to that. Also, another big issue that comes to mind is how that we'll be able to work with the community in a way that's saying that this is different. This is a new technology. This is a new approach that won't be like the ones before. So how can we communicate that and get, again, the community's buy-in and support for that? I think that's going to be a big challenge. And then finally, the last issue that I would like to mention is seeing the need for having a broad partnership and having a community involvement in all different aspects. For example, not just working with people and focusing on the accessibility aspect, but also for working with people that have a view in corporate copyright issues. So that can be very hard to provide more accessibility with copyright issues, and getting past all that red tape, as far as equipment goes and everything. So that can cause more barriers, for accessibility of information for the users. And that's a concern that I have, that if we set up a new technology, regarding cameras, if cameras and audio accessibility, now again, that can cause a conflict with security issues and copyright issues because of content creation. And so that also causes an issue. And that's, again, because of technology coming out when the systems aren't prepared for it and they're not ready for it. So those are just things that I have to mention, and that maybe those are things that we could try to find a new approach for. I'll let the next person take over from there.
Okay.
Greg, would it be okay to just have a quick response there before going to the next one?
Sure. Let's do a quick response.
So just a quick response, because I thought there was like some spectacular points there, but definitely acknowledged on the similarities to overlay. So just to be clear about that, I won't speak for Greg, but overlays are snake oil. They are unmitigated and objectively inaccurate things that are, only there to make money. They are shill. So 100% agreed. And I spend a lot of my day convincing people not to use them. I do think that we also should really acknowledge and amplify the lack of trust in the community for something like this. I think that's a good thing. I actually think that the level of skepticism is not enough of new technologies and claims that we're making here, because if we're going to make extraordinary claims, we should have extraordinary evidence, and persons with disabilities have been burned far too often by the kinds of early adoption you're talking about, where someone goes, oh, I don't have to hire interpreters anymore. Automatic captions are good enough. And we all know automatic captions are not good enough. I just want to say that I also simultaneously think it's true that they eventually can be, but we need to make sure we're asserting a really, really high level of skepticism and a very rigorous evidence standard before that switch is flipped. Because you're absolutely right that the predominant audience that has been perpetually harmed in just repeatedly by this kind of early adoption is persons with disabilities. And I just, that's an excellent point. We shouldn't lose track of that.
Yeah, and I think the other part is the IUIDs, et cetera, need to be designed by people who are deaf and
Exactly.
people who are deaf, and it's going to be involvement. This isn't anything that's going to happen overnight. But yes, it's going to have to prove itself. And the key, I think, is what Sina mentioned, is that you don't foist on it, and we be careful that other people don't say, oh, if this is coming, I can stop today, because we can't do that for sure. Clayton?
Thanks, Greg. So yeah, like Christian, I've worked quite a while with Greg and have been intrigued by the infobot notion, and in particular recently I've been intrigued by what contribution the large language models that we've been talking about a bit might make in this space. And in light of what was just said, I want to say in advance that take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, and I'll elaborate on that. But I want to start with a use case. So several years ago, we had a program in which we spent time in the lab with people recovering from stroke, suffering from aphasia. And so one of the people I was working with who had trouble speaking struggled to say to me, what she was doing was showing me her attempts to use the web. And she struggled to say to me, I have to read everything. So what she wanted me to understand was that she, like a good many other people, we're not generally aware of this, but there are many people who can't skim. They can read, but they can't skim. Okay. So for most people, what can be called wide interfaces are better than narrow ones that put out all the choices and let you just look for the thing you want. For people who can skim, that kind of interface is really good. For that reason, they're quite common. But if you're like this person, that's a disaster because you can't read all that stuff. I mean, life is too short. So it occurred to me to wonder whether a large language model, GPT-3 in this case, could help with that. So I scraped the screen, so to speak, of I just happened to pick the list of departments that's on the Amazon main page dropdown. So I don't know, there are like 50 departments there. And so I packed that stuff in at the beginning of an input to GPT-3, which of course could be done, behind the scenes. I packed that all in, and then I followed it with, I'd like to buy tires. And the response was, what department should I pick? And the response was, you should pick the department that depends on what kind of tires you're looking for. If you're looking for bicycle tires, you should look in sporting equipment. If you're looking for automobile tires, you'd look under automobile accessories, which in this case is completely correct. So just one grain of salt you need to take this with, and maybe everybody knows this, they don't, they should. It's pretty lucky that this response turned out to be accurate. Okay, the way these things are now, they hallucinate freely. But nevertheless, I think it's worth highlighting an aspect of this emerging technology that's likely to be very important in the infobot space. I'd say in one way or another, many people have kind of referred to this. There's not a good name for it known to me, so I'm going to suggest the name integrative semantics as opposed to discriminative semantics. So conventional automation tries to work by carving the world up into tiny little parts, and it can identify a particular part that it knows how to deal with. But nothing good is going to happen if you're not in that part or in one of the small finite number of parts that it's actually able to deal with. In these large language models, for all their faults, we're seeing for the first time in my experience, systems that aren't like that. They're not constrained by a priori domain boundaries. It didn't say, come on, you're asking about tires. I don't know about tires. It does know about tires. It knows some stuff about tires. So I think that that this technology is likely to be useful in this kind of way. I also did an experiment which was interesting, not as successful, I would say, in which I tried to engage one of these systems in a discussion of how I should buy something on the web. And it kind of works, but I would say not very well. So the current systems are quite verbose, and it's difficult to get them to understand what would help you in expressing more clearly what needs to be done. So they tend to start by giving instructions, which are of course taken from documentation ultimately. And those instructions, generally don't work very well for people who aren't technical. And in my efforts to sort of get it, come on, I'm not so good on the web, it said, well, instead of buying this online, you should go to a bricks and mortar store, which really wasn't helpful in the context. What I wanted was simplified instructions on how to use the Amazon website. But nevertheless, I wanted to register some optimism under the heading of Infobot. But I think this notion of integrative semantics, systems that actually have some knowledge of a very wide, not strictly predefined set of terminology and concepts, may play a helpful role in helping people express goals and to map those goals onto intentions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sina and I will probably try and hold our comments so that we can get through everybody else. And if you can sort of highlight in a harvesting fashion your key thoughts so we can get all the way around the pike at least once first, and then we'll come back around again with another pass as well. Next is Jeff number 1, Jeff Bigham.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. I guess Jeff number 2 will be sad to learn he's Jeff number 2. So I'm Jeff Bigham. So I was really fascinated to hear kind of this overview from Sina and Greg. I think it's great, a great aspirational goal. When I was first started talking to Greg 15 years ago, I think we were just trying to figure out how could we get assistive technology to everyone. And while that's not entirely figured out, I think we're so much closer with so many amazing features, accessibility features built into the devices that we all have in our pockets and on our desks. So I think that's really amazing. And to move on to this next stage of we have all of these amazing accessibility features in everyone's pockets and on their desks. And now we have to figure out, of all those features, how do we help people kind of match into them? And how do we help people learn how to use them? And how do we help people kind of further adapt those systems and the software they use so they actually work seamlessly with all of those? So I'm really excited about that. And to make it really short, I think what I'm really, really intrigued by is this idea of how do we go from this amazing set of parts that we have right now and the amazing developments that we're seeing. What's that 20 years look like? And whether it's 20 years or 50 years or 100 years, I think there's this fascinating progression where we're going to have to do some really interesting hard work to figure out how these things fit together. And I'll just leave with a final thought. So my kind of pithy response to a lot of the large language model stuff, the amazing developments in AI right now is it's a fascinating and fantastic set of prototyping tools. So we get 95% of the way there almost immediately. And yet I think, and what I've seen is that design stage that we wish everyone would go through, which is substantial and hard work, that seems to be just as long and maybe even longer than it ever has been to get to that product we'd really be excited about and proud of, and that we think wouldn't have those devastating errors that we sometimes worry about. And so how do we actually, maybe shorten that or think through like what that means to bridge us from where we are, which is pretty amazing if you look back even 15 years to where we want to get in that amazing vision that you all set out in the first part of this. So thank you.
Yeah, everybody knows the 80-20 rule. When you think you're 80% of the way there, and there's only 20% left, it's still 80% of the effort needed for that. Look up 80-20, it just applies all over the place, and it really does here. Jeff has been doing this much longer than Jeff, but he alphabetically is number 2 only. Jeff Nichols.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm always Jeff number 2, it seems, but that's okay. And Greg's right. I have been doing like interface generation work. So you think about, I think more maybe the second half of the iBot idea for, unfortunately, more than 20 years, I guess. But I've also been thinking a lot about how we can make our user interfaces more malleable. That's the term I tend to use, but flexible, I think we also talked about here. I had a whole hour-long talk on different ways to do that because there are a lot of different opportunities. But I think, I think one of the big parts of making this iBot vision a reality, and was talked a little bit, I think, about Greg and Sina, is shifting our approach from trying to understand interfaces from the infrastructure layer, trying to get down in there and understand, on the iPhone, what is UIKit doing or what's Swift UI doing, or understanding what Unity is doing, and trying to understand those things from basically the way they're built, and then try to percolate that up to the user. That's an approach that I just think is not sustainable. There are many toolkits out there. We're never going to be able to interface with all of them. Someone is going to create a new one next week and the week after. So, that's really not an approach we can take going forward, even though it's the one we've used up until this point. And so, something I've been very excited about for the last few years is what I call UI understanding. And so this idea is taking all of, computer vision and other ML techniques, applying them to user interfaces, in order to kind of extract what's there without needing to understand anything underneath. So if it's a graphical interface, we understand the pixels. Conceivably, if we want to understand a speech interface, we would try to listen to the audio waveforms. We build our understanding from that. And then on top of that understanding, there are many other things we can do to make those interfaces more flexible. We've already at Apple released a product, which I don't know how people here feel about it, but it's called screen recognition. It's an extension to the VoiceOver screen reader. So you can either use kind of infrastructure mode, which I think is still definitely better for most apps. But if that doesn't work, if the app hasn't, put its metadata or what up, one of, I think, the very first uses of UI understanding technology is there. You can switch to screen recognition mode. We can pull out the elements that are there on the screen, and you can at least navigate around and see what's there. But I do think that points out one of the challenges that we're going to have for the iBot, which is that, yeah, we can understand what the elements that are there, but we can't yet understand like what are the tasks that people want to do with this interface. And so I think that's one of the big challenges that is next in UI understanding, going from like kind of the static understanding of what's on the screen, even dynamic understanding of what screens are there and how you get through them. The next one is task. How do we understand what are the tasks that people want to do? How can we make that, you know, something that we can surface instead of just the raw elements? And then for sure after that, even, you know, being able to generate interfaces is also a super hard problem that hopefully, you know, all this new generative AI maybe can help us with. But we're still obviously a long ways away as well. So I will leave it at that and let whoever's next go.
I think that's really excellent, especially you're talking about the limitations on our on the older approach. It's come a long way, but if it's running out of juice, we have to figure out how to hit the rest. Next is Jennifer Mankoff, and she and Sean are from the home of ability-based design, which we talked about. And I think that that's going to have a real, which focuses on the individual rather than on groups or populations. And I think that that's going to have a large part to play here. Jennifer.
Thank you. I have a couple of disparate points to make, I think. So one is, being somebody who does a lot of fabrication research, I just want to encourage folks to think about how we might take some of these same ideas about making interfaces dynamic and easy to customize and bring that into the physical world. The next point I have, just throwing out some things that haven't been said yet, is that if we're going to start using AI to address accessibility, we need to deal with both the accessibility community and the AI and data collection processes, biases, specifically against people of color, as well as against people with disabilities. And we have to look at the intersection of those as well. And so we can't accept things that work if we're not also doing the work to make sure that we're addressing the needs of like marginalized people with disabilities, for example, or we're going to make those disparities even larger. So just wanted to highlight that point. And then the last thing I just sort of add is that in addition to thinking about people with multiple disabilities, I think we should also be thinking about spaces that have multiple people with disabilities present in them, and how we can ensure that the work we do in Access addresses not only ways that people with disabilities can produce and access solutions with these tools, but also how to make sure that we're spreading that responsibility around to everybody who's present. So
Excellent.
I'll leave it there.
Thank you. One quick comment is people also talk about discrimination of people with disabilities as if people with disabilities is one group and they're discriminated with all in the same way. And we need to keep in mind that there's many different dimensions and they have many different kinds of discrimination we need to keep in mind. Shari, great to be seeing you again. Shari and I also go back a really long way. And this reminds, you even heard me mention 24/7/52 in the comments there briefly. So Shari had a lot of work on that. Your comments. You're not muted on Zoom, but we don't hear you. So let me go to Sean and see if you can figure out, try it without your headset maybe. Oh, you already did that. All right. Sean, let's go to you and then we'll come back to Shari. It's okay, Shari, if you want to test anytime in there, just go test if you think you've got it.
That's fine. All right. I was really nervous listening to all these lovely people talk that any good idea I had would have come up already. And so I'll just say all the really thoughtful things that people said before. I was going to say those too and take the credit for those. But there are a couple of things that I wanted to, I was just reflecting on in seeing this grand and very exciting vision. And so just a couple of themes that stand out to me. So one is the role of, I'm going to call it friction. So thinking about, as we're talking about automatic adaptation and AI systems that know what to do, there's this theme that the system will do the right thing, right? Or it will do something reasonable. And if the user doesn't like that, then maybe they can give some feedback or whatever it is. And I'll say just, from my own personal experience, my entire life, people have been doing that work of guessing what kind of accessibility needs I might have, or guessing what kind of accommodations I need. And, these people are still smarter than ChatGPT, but they get it wrong all the time, right? So I think we really need to be focusing on thinking about feedback mechanisms, customization mechanisms, programming tools, and other sorts of friction between the user and the system. So it's not just guessing the right thing and you just go with that. A side note to that, and I'll say, I think there's also, I've heard stories, and I would say my own experience, but also talking to folks like Sina of, at an early age, having this ability to really analyze accessibility problems and analyze how our technology architectures might cause accessibility problems, and how that leads to creating, problem solvers who can help solve these big problems. And so I think we also need to have room for understanding what's going on in the system and being able to tinker, being able to make choices. Two other things I wanted to mention. So one is, thinking about visibility and communication, right? So, I've had many conversations with people about accessibility, and I've heard people say, oh, I noticed at the ATM that there was Braille, or that there was that easy access. And that got me thinking about inclusion more generally. And so there's a lot in our culture, I think, of communication through assistive technology, through artifacts around disability, like canes and other sorts of things. And if we're thinking about that is now very personal, then it's going to change some of these identity issues, perhaps, right? Or we might lose some visibility, especially from the perspective of designers, that people with disabilities are using your stuff. And if you don't get accessibility right, then here are specific people who are being excluded. The last point I just want to say is, I think, somewhat to Jen's point, that there are, all these issues now of like intersectional identity, where people are perhaps facing accessibility like problems, even though they might not identify as having a disability, right? So now if we have algorithms that are saying, oh, well, your data is in this cluster of disabled, then we might run into some other, we're going to run into some other challenges there about communicating that to users, about how they might approach it, about pushing a disabled identity onto someone maybe. And so I think there's a lot of potential concerns around there, around just what these classifications are and how people might navigate them.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, good. Were you finished, John?
I am, yes. Go ahead.
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Yeah, so everybody said such great things, and it's so exciting to be part of this conversation. And I've been a fan of devices adapting to people and personalizing themselves for people for a really long time now. One thing I think it would be fun to challenge you with on this is, you talked a little bit, I'm going to point my Infobot at a screen and it'll understand the pixels. So what are we going to do with our holograms and our 3D digital environments, and how might it work in this future that we've been imagining for the last couple of days? I think to solve that, first we have to solve the, well, how do we translate that form of information into other modalities and other combinations of modalities. Potentially we have a future where standard interfaces are going to assume multiple control streams. They're going to assume that you're using audio and visual and tactile all together in concert. And I don't think we've solved the problem yet of how do we adapt an interface that's designed like that. So before we can have our iBot for those kind of interfaces. I think we have a lot more fundamental research to do about what are the general transformations. Second thing I wanted to say, let's not throw away the concept of accessibility at source just because it has its limits. I think it's still really important, and important that content is created in as transformable and accessible a way as it can be. So if I have atypical speech and I'm making a video, I should be able to use my personal speech recognition to create good captions and then correct the captions so that everybody else who consumes it doesn't have to have their own amazing personal technology. And I think that's super important when we think about that. Not everybody's going to have access to these fancy personal technologies, and we'll reach more people more quickly by doing things at source. So I wouldn't want to give up on that dream. And AI is writing code now. AI is generating interfaces at source now. Right now, it's probably not generating very accessible interfaces because it's trained on what we have today. But what do we need to do right now so that in the future, it will generate accessible interfaces? And so each company doesn't need as much expertise, and it's easier for them to serve more accessible things that are compatible with AT.
Excellent. Well, we've run around, so we'll do some responses and then come back around again. A couple things, Sherry, just on yours. The first thing that I said is this isn't to replace what we're doing now, but it's to try and to reach all of the places where we aren't reaching now. And unfortunately, that's a huge part. I loved your idea of using AI to generate accessible at source. So if I have something that can recognize and change something to sign language and stuff, and it's part of this iBot and the IUIGs, why couldn't we apply it up front? And then it's, just, comes out of the gate. Or if you say, well, you can't make it come out of the gate with the right thing. For example, some people like things to be signed in great detail. Some people like it to be signed simpler because they can't. Some people want captions that are full captions. Other people say that's ridiculous. I'm trying to read somebody who's talking at that speed in a foreign language because that's not my language. That, captions are useless to me. So but what we could generate different levels. We could make stuff preconditioned. So that's really great. You had mentioned, holograms, and the idea of the iBot is that it can see, hear, smell. One of the things Sina talked about is the ability to be able to use all of the different senses that we use to gather information. And then represent it to people who can't see, hear, or smell in the form that they were doing. So on the holograms, again, if you can see it, hear it, whatever, that would be the same input that the InfoBot would get. You mentioned not everyone access, and that's one of the reasons why I really think that this has got to be, the iBot's got to be free, open source, and in the cloud, downloadable so that anybody can use it locally as soon as they have something that can hold it in the cloud if they don't have anything that has that ability. Because we're doing more and better at making things accessible to people who are in rich countries. We have on our, one of our teams says, where's the global south? Where are they in all of this? And so I'm really worried about that. And so that you highlighted that one. I thought that was really good. So Jen, I would like to first question back to you is you had talked about the physical world and you said, could we move this into the physical world? Now, some places you can see that like a thermostat or something that has a digital interface in the physical world still fits into this sort of iBot idea. You aim your camera at it and it gives you an interface, et cetera. But beyond that, did you have, I'd just like you to say a couple words about if you, aside from the fact that can we do it, that would be good. We did see some things yesterday from the VR presentations about physical worlds, and on the website you'll find places where they raise and lower things so that you could perhaps take a stairway and change it into a ramp dynamically. But that would be kind of a big construction job with a lot of power because it would have to hold it. Did you have, other than that was a really fascinating idea and you got me really thinking, did you have any examples of something you could think of where we might do that?
Yeah, I think a lot of what I think about is sort of solutions that might be static once they're produced, but we use generative design to let people customize them, or add-ons for existing physical objects that can make them easier to use. So if you have trouble squeezing a spray bottle, how can you modify it to make that functional for you? Or there's so many ways that we could imagine modifying the world. And the fabrication technologies that we have today are not really easily supporting end users in modifying objects that may be too big to even fit on a print bed or to model easily, or just that need good attachment mechanisms in order for us to modify how they work. We may need to think about both mechanical and physical design that can meet specific needs, might need to integrate different kinds of materials. We've been doing work with knitting machines and trying to understand if we could take an existing pattern and modify it to meet the needs of a person with a disability. So maybe you want to have a place in your hat, as somebody who posted on Ravelry did, that is an opening. So if you use some kind of a hearing aid, the sound can travel more freely, or you want to change the shape of part of your sweater so that you can sit in a wheelchair more comfortably. So there's lots of ways we can modify static objects. We also need to see innovation in what's possible with dynamic tactile interfaces. And this work is starting to be done in our community, but Braille displays are still limited to very small numbers of characters at very high cost. For example, dynamic tactile pictures. There's technology coming out now about that. We need to figure out what to do with it. So there's a post in the chat actually about using generative AI by Andreas Forslund to design novel prosthetics and orthotics or eyewear that fits craniofacial variations. And I think in doing this kind of work, it's really important to also draw from the expertise of the existing maker communities that are addressing these things. So there's a lot of medical making that's going on in undocumented fashion in many different settings. And there's a very large history of DIY fixes being put together by the disability community and textbooks full of information about these, but they're not necessarily using modern day fabrication technologies. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. That was very helpful. And it kind of goes back to Shari's, use AI at the source instead of after the fact. Only the source of what? The source of clothing, the source of eyewear, etc. Many of the people in the call know that if you are a wheelchair user, you need to have your suits and things cut differently, and dresses, or they just don't work. Could you, have it, aim it at any design and have it give the specifications to whoever it is for how it ought to be fabricated differently so it would fit you. If you have scoliosis, it's almost impossible to buy severe scoliosis, to buy anything that's going to fit you. And it all has to be custom tailor-made. Well, that gets to be really expensive and limiting. And then, of course, it goes all the way into designing wheelchairs so that they better fit you. So that's a fascinating dimension hadn't thought of before. I'm trying to see, are there any questions that the panel noticed on the web? I'm trying to do this and scan the questions also. But let me loop back and say, anybody raise your hand and jump in to communicate, because we've been around the table. So you can add to, expand on your comments. And Sina, you also have, you now become the voice of God, because we had to turn your camera off. So let me toss to you and see if you had some comments you wanted to make about.
Well, just wanted to, I'll leave the video off just in case it does the flickering thing, if that's okay. But essentially wanted to comment on the idea of this I really think we need to not assume that things will go well is an overwhelming, like prevailing assertion from multiple panelists. So I just don't want to lose track of that, where we really should not assume that things are going to work well and then operate off of that principle. It's how are we designing for that? I refer to it as graceful degradation. Not only in the case of where certain infrastructure may not exist, but in the case where, not if, but when the computer gets it wrong. And I think that's really important, because as we ask for these systems to do more complex and deeply personal and important things in our lives, the impact of those things being gotten wrong is even more. I just want to highlight or maybe echo Clayton's note of optimism, but maybe out of a sense of necessity, and say, as somebody who has, definitely suffered from when systems have gotten it wrong as a result of their disability, I personally, I'm not speaking for anybody else, I'm willing to roll the dice on this one and hope that we can work towards getting that right and being thoughtful and intentional about it and learning from the myriad of mistakes we've made in the past when trying to do similar things, because it just cannot be overstated how deeply ineffectual, disastrous, and just unusable the current system is. And that is truly going to get worse at an exponential rate. So, I just want to hold those two thoughts simultaneously if we can, and echo as much as possible this need for getting it right and making sure we're solving for all the cases when it doesn't get it right, but then also acknowledging that the urgency is real here to do something different than what's been done before.
Yes. Other thoughts? Christian, I see your hand up, and then Shari. Christian?
Hi, yes, this is Christian. And I just want to throw in just another thought into the bucket here. Now, if we did build the iBot for translation for the user's needs, I also wanted to throw in about thinking about the delay, the latency. And so that also affects language users now, and the interpreters, in terms of like the delay of translating from one language to the next. Example of that is, when I have my cochlear implant attached to equipment, there is a bit of a delay in terms of the machine sending it to my cochlear implant and the processing of that. I think with the iBot, we're going to have to make sure that it's able to work on these different platforms and work with this delay. And sometimes, a delay won't be impertinent to the information, whereas in other situations it is. For example, with the microwave, the latency doesn't really matter in a situation like that. But if you're communicating with another person, if you're playing a game, perhaps, a latency delay becomes really important in that gameplay. So that would just mean that we'd have to try this out on different platforms and make whatever adjustments are needed depending on what application this is being used for. If a delay is acceptable or if it will impact the user negatively.
This is Sina. That's a really important point. It's so critical to not understate how important performance is. For example, as a blind person, there is exactly one type of Bluetooth headphone I can use, full stop. And that's AirPods from Apple or anything else with that chip. Because every other pair of Bluetooth headphones in the world doesn't have the latency such that I can effectively use it with a screen reader. And yet, I'm not doing gaming. I'm not trying to win any kind of, first person shooter competitions in the gaming arena or anything like that. But I care about that level of latency because the distance of time between when I swipe on a piece of glass and when I hear the text to speech synthesized has only been solved in a singular product, even though every other person that is not reliant on a screen reader has, thousands of different products to choose from. So this is a really critical point.
Okay, one point, the concept is info bot, not iBot. And even though that occasionally I will say iBot, so I will disclaim that one right off the bat. I'm sure that iBot is owned by somebody else or will be by Apple in the future. So we'll stick with Infobot and try not to get into any copyright wars. Shari.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the piece of what's not working today that is around the barrier for people to do their own personalization. So even when we have, Greg and the folks at the Trade Center put sticky keys into desktops decades ago, but I still meet people who've never heard of it and are so excited when I tell them about it. And like, this is also another unsolved problem. And I'm wondering if there is a sort of an evolution here towards Infobot world that starts with understanding how better we connect people with what works for them, how better we discover what works for them so that we can help them get to configurations. It doesn't always need to be a whole new user interface. Sometimes it's a tweak on a setting that makes the world of difference, or just being able to say, that little icon up there is really distracting me. Can you make that go away? So maybe there's like an evolution of changing the existing interface in small ways towards the sort of more radical sounding Infobot whole new interface.
Okay. Jeff.
Yeah, so I'm gonna talk about very briefly. I want to give an advertisement for this paper we have called Recommending Accessibility. So Sherry, it kind of gets at that point, like how can we use machine learning to kind of recognize when people might benefit from accessibility features? So I think other people have worked on this, but I'd love for people to check that out. One thing I really like this point that Sina made about errors and how do we help people kind of navigate through this, and also optimism, and how the situation right now maybe is not so great, and so even errors may not be as kind of detrimental or like show-stopping as we might think. And I think it's really useful because we have to think about case studies. I think we have at least 3 case studies that I think are interesting to think about. So we've already mentioned sort of the overlays versus other kind of approaches like screen recognition, which Jeff mentioned. How do we think about like errors and what works and what doesn't and how we position it? So I think there's a good case study there. I think captioning, so automatic captioning, I kind of was of the opinion that this was not going to be useful, and it's certainly not a replacement, but I think people have found value and started to find value now that it's better, even though it's not perfect, because it's always available, especially in calls like this one, or maybe this one is big enough we can have a professional, but in kind of one-on-one calls, kind of impromptu. So people have started to find value. And then the other thing, a call I totally got wrong was image description. And so especially early on, a few years ago, when it was not very good, I thought, oh, people aren't going to want this. It's got all these errors in it. Like, why would people? And yet people found incredible value from this pretty early on. And so I think sussing out like how do we think about this? Because I think it's often unintuitive.
That's a really good point. Something that you always have and works everywhere has a value beyond something that's really, really good, but it's at home, or I don't have it with me, or it only works on one place or one site or one product. So I think that's a real advantage or area for using some of this. Other questions? We're getting right close to the end. Before we get to the end, I want to make sure anybody else had any other thoughts. If you see me looking left and right, it's because I've got you lined up in a stripe across here. Oh, Vince, thanks for joining us.
Well, I've been lurking, like many, of course. I just wanted to draw attention to one possibility, and that's to parse content into 2 classes. One class is content that's real time, it's being generated, it's unfolding in an unpredictable way, like sports games and things like that, or this conference for that matter. And then there is material which has been created prior to its rendering. And in many cases, that means that we could apply a lot of effort to making it accessible prior to the time that it becomes available. And so we should distinguish between those 2 challenges because the pre-recorded, so to speak, material or pre-prepared material might be more amenable to effective treatment. The other point, of course, is that material that's being created in real time does create a latency challenge that other things don't. Last point, I've been making heavy use of the Chrome browser right now that's doing automatic captioning. And I have to say that that's turning out to be very, very helpful because the latency is quite low, even when it makes mistakes.
Yeah, and so that reminds me back of Shari's comment. If it is pre-prepared, why not run it through all this, whatever processing and intelligence we can before it goes out, and maybe even offer it in different forms for people who need it in different forms, rather than have to have it done, live at the last minute. Okay, I'm looking back and forth, not seeing a hand. One thing to again, as we close this out, is to keep a focus that on this idea of the IBOT and IUIGs. The primary focus of this is for the products that are not being done at source. And as much as we say that, well, it would be better if it was done at source, it's 90% of products are not done at source. And we've been now beating and passing laws and everything else. And the places that can and will do it, have been doing it. And we're sort of running out. We're not gaining any more traction there. And there's still a big gap. For people we currently don't cover with access at source. And sometimes it's just because people just, they don't have they cover X number and they stop, and all the rest of these people hang off. In some places, we just don't know how to do it. We just don't know how to make some of these things accessible. And so we spent a lot of time trying to write this up. And then sometimes we find that it's commercially just not going to be practical. If we went up to all the TV companies and HBO and Apple TV, et cetera, and said, it's really confusing for older people, two things. One, that you're all different from each other. So we want you to make all your interfaces the same. It's just not going to happen. Okay. And so people who are older are going to have to figure that when they go from one to another of these services that are all on just different buttons on one screen, they're going to not understand what's happening. The other thing is we could tell them, oh, don't keep changing it. Whatever it is, don't change it anymore. And that's not going to happen either. In some cases I was talking and they said, well, you keep saying that it's because a new designer came in and the designer wanted to have a different design. And he said, that's true a lot of the times. He said, but sometimes the accountant comes in. And I go, the accountant? And they said, yeah. But they find is that if you make it so that it's really sort of confusing in this way, people will tend to click just on the ones at the top because it's just too much work. And they click on the ones that they make the most money on, or that generate the most customer retention because it's not on any other program, and things like this, sort of self-advertising. And so there may be commercial forces that are going to, and again, the burden typically falls on cognitive language and learning areas, and that's a concern. So so that's the focus for the reason for this thinking and the reason for this approach to supplement the accessible at source. I love the ideas that came up today about these same concepts could also be used to help make more things accessible at source. And so that is great. So, increase things that can be at source. But we also have to figure out how to address all of the other products that either won't, for whatever reason, we can't get them, or places that they're just too variable. You can't make a product be accessible for every type, degree, and combination of disability at the same time. There's just too many. Already people are complaining that there's too many accessibility features in the iPhone. And I go, what do you mean by that? There's so many of them that you can't figure out which one. So here's where I love the example. I'm trying to remember who said it. It was Clayton. where they said, I have this problem. Which of these features should I be turning on? So you actually have to involve it to turn on the source features as we go forward.